Hello to my fellow instrumentalists who have already subscribed to the channel, and hi to the rest of you who haven't yet. I'm Jacques Gadway, and this is Gadway Violin. On today's episode of the Monday Music Method, by the way, these are weekly live streams we're doing. We've decided officially every Monday, for the most part, at around 5 p.m. In today's episode, we're taking a look, continuing our work on 6 carols and 6 gifts. This is a PDF booklet that contains, as it says, 6 carols and 6 gifts. The gifts in this case are etudes. If you've been following this series already, you probably already know this, but each of these individual carols is going to be corresponding to a specific etude which tackles a technique. In today's day, we are on the 4th day, so this is our 4th carol, Silent Night, which you heard me play in the beginning, and we're taking a look at its corresponding etude, which is going to deal with finger independence. So, here we are with Silent Night. If you'd like your own copy of this music, you can obviously take a screen capture and use it that way, or if you'd like to support the channel, you can actually find it with the link below on the website for sale. But there's no need to purchase it. If you want, you can just follow along with the video. The music will be on screen pretty much continuously. With that, let's start by looking at the very first part of this, which is the actual carol. We're going to be talking about fingerings and what we can use this carol for. Again, one of the primary focuses of this little booklet and series this time of year is to help you prepare if you've been a hobbyist violinist perhaps, or more advanced than that. Either way, your family and friends are probably wondering what you do with the instrument on your free time, and the holidays are always a great opportunity to break out the violin from its case and showcase some of your skills. So the carols are for you to play for others, and the gifts, the etudes, are kind of for you in the practice room to benefit from with your own technical work. But let's start by talking about the carol. Let's jump right in to Silent Night. The way that I played it in the beginning is a little bit more tricky than we need to play it in general. We can follow a normal, easy fingering by just playing this all in first pretty much, but I do have some suggested fingerings throughout. Again, on the channel, if you ever see a finger written underneath one of my parts, it means that that is the finger that you're shifting to, and it's basically telling you that you're going to have to do something other than what you'd expect. If there's no fingering written, you can assume it's probably going to be in first position, as is the case here. So let's start from the very beginning. So the way that I played it just there was where I essentially did absolutely zero shifting, and we did it all in first position. This is by far the simplest way that we can go about playing this. If you were to do this version, you would essentially just have to ignore all the fingerings that I've written throughout, but that shouldn't be too big of a deal. The main thing is if you want to play it in first position, which is totally fine, I would recommend, because of how slow this piece of music is, to just, if you can, avoid all open strings. So don't do any open strings, use 4th fingers basically everywhere. That's just simply because there's a huge difference in sound quality, and timbre is the word, when you play a stopped note versus an open string. And I think we're all pretty much aware of that. So a good example would be at the end of that line. If we use opens, especially if you're already at the point where you're using vibrato regularly. In general, throughout this booklet, all of the carols are going to be pretty much approachable by beginners or maybe advanced beginners, we might call them. And then each of the etudes is going to be more geared towards intermediate and advanced intermediate. So this booklet can be useful to you basically wherever your journey is with the instrument. Now, what was that word we just said? I just want to write it out so that we know we have it. The word is timbre, but we spell it with an I for some reason. Timbre. And all that refers to is just, we might think of it as the color of our notes. And once again, even if you're playing this in first position, a way to make a more consistent timbre or color throughout this entire carol is to just avoid any open strings, just because, again, it's really kind of a slow carol and it's going to be really jarring, especially if you're doing some kind of vibrato. Which I think brings us to our next point. One of the best ways we can really bring this carol to life is going to be by utilizing our vibrato. Let's talk a little bit about vibrato as a result. If you're new to the channel, you might not know my thoughts on vibrato, but if you want a real deep dive, you can definitely check out a video on vibrato I've made on the channel. You can do that by searching Gadway Violin vibrato. But beside that, we can talk briefly about it right now. Some of the techniques and some of the things I think about when I'm doing vibrato is I think about how I'm actually achieving that pitch bend. And I think a lot of the time when we talk about vibrato, there's an overemphasis on thinking about how we're moving the hand, literally back and forth. Are you using the wrist or are you using the arm? And generally, I think the main focus should be thinking about the literal boots on the ground. What's making the pitch change? And remember, whenever we're using or touching the strings on the instrument, we create changes in pitch by essentially changing the length of the vibrating string. Our bow is touching by the bridge somewhere, and wherever we place our finger makes it so that what's left vibrating is shorter than before, therefore increasing the pitch. That principle holds true with vibrato. With vibrato, we are starting from usually the highest point or the shortest string, and then we are lengthening the string slightly in some way. And I think the most efficient way to lengthen the string is to utilize or take advantage of this final finger joint and to allow it to try and collapse slightly. And you can see that I can physically collapse that and create a big difference in pitch with almost no movement in the hand, which just goes to show that a lot of the time all this extraneous movement, all this extra stuff is not as necessary as we expect. Of course, it's very useful and it's going to be the ultimate way that you do physically do your vibrato. You're going to have some kind of wiggle in the hand and or wrist and or entire forearm, but just always remembering that the boots on the ground is right here. What's really creating that pitch bend is that knuckle there. Allows us to make sure that whatever we're doing in the wrist, hand, and forearm is extremely practical and it's directly correlating to that movement. We want it to be purposeful and not just moving with great veracity for no reason. Now, one of the things I like about this carol when we're talking about vibrato is it has a tiered sense of rhythm. We have very clearly long notes, slightly less long notes, and then we have our fastest notes, which are the eighth notes. And depending on where you are with your vibrato practice, you can decide ahead of time if you're going to vibrato on all the notes, if you're going to vibrato on most of the notes, or if you're going to vibrato on the longest notes only. This has to do with how long it takes you to literally get your vibrato going and how fast your vibrato is at a comfortable level. So what I mean by that is if you're very, very new to vibrato, you could play this and think of it like, I'm going to make sure I vibrato this could be your rule, every single dotted half, right? So in other words, we're not going to vibrato anything that is faster than a dotted half. We're only going to vibrato our dotted halves. What might that look like? You might hear that and think, that sounds kind of ridiculous. It sounds a little silly, but the idea is that, well, first of all, we don't need to vibrato every single note all the time in violin playing, and I think there's an overemphasis in that in violin studies in general. Vibrato should be used as a tool to ornament. It should be used as a tool, maybe not to ornament, maybe that's not the right word, but it should be used as a tool expressively. We should be using it with purpose. And putting a blanket vibrato on everything, while it is a skill that you can gain and might be useful in some very specific cases, I think that most useful is knowing how to use your vibrato at will exactly where you want it. So already, even if you're a beginner at vibrato, deciding ahead of time where you're going to put the vibrato and starting with not every note, but specific notes, and you can do this by either thinking of note values, like we did here, or by beats in the measure, which we'll talk about a little later, or by thinking about phrase and where the peak of your phrase is, for example. Let's continue on with thinking about it rhythmically, first off, and then we'll get into some of the other areas. By the way, at any point during this live stream, if you have any questions, we have a very small audience here with the Monday music method, and that means a good thing for you because it means I can pretty much check out any of your questions in real time and answer them, so long as they don't take us down a crazy tangent. So with that, let's move on. You saw the example of us thinking of dotted halves. Now, what if we wanted to incorporate even more of our rhythms? We could take it a step further and just say, let's add in, we're going to vibrato every note that is either a dotted half, or we would say it, that is either a half note or longer. So any note that's a half note or longer. This is, again, just one way of thinking about segmenting our vibrato. And we can go on with this trend. Let's do any note that is at least a dotted quarter note or longer. So now you're seeing we're going to vibrate each of these. And so forth. Like I said, there's other ways of thinking about this and tiering your vibrato and thinking about it as a way of being expressive. That way was more of a way of dealing with it in a easy sense of vibratoing easy notes, in other words. But you can also vibrato instead notes that have different levels of importance. We talk in music theory and in violin playing about strong beats versus weak beats. So we can start from this as an example. Why don't we vibrato every strong beat in each measure? In the case of 3/4, our strong beats are generally just going to be the first beats. 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 3, 2, 3. So why don't we try vibratoing every first note of the measure? Things that happens when we do this is we see immediately if it sounds weird or if it feels weird, it most likely means that where we're vibratoing is telling us that that's not the important part of our phrase and or our measure. because we're bringing out a part that perhaps shouldn't be leaned on or brought out so much. So what might feel more natural in that phrase than what if instead we thought about blossoming our vibrato towards the middle of each of those measures? Almost towards that A, right? That almost sounds a little bit more natural to me, which might be indicative of what the shape of the measure and or phrase should be naturally. And that kind of thing can help us make these decisions as to how we want to phrase our carol. I know it's just a carol, but even carols can have this level of thought behind what we choose to do with our phrasing. If you watched some of our previous streams, we did talk about phrasing, especially in the O Holy Night. And one of the things we talk about with phrasing, which is the next way we can think about vibratoing, is we think about every phrase. First, you have to determine how long the phrase is. In this case, that's probably one phrase there. That's a little bit subjective, I'll admit. You could argue it's here, right? You could argue it's even longer, that it goes all the way here. But regardless, you should pick within whatever you've decided your phrase to be. In this case, we've decided it to be here, where your peak is, or where your most important arrival is. And then in each phrase you have one of those. And then in the entire piece you have to determine what the hierarchy is. So let's imagine we're just going to visually pick some. We'll pick a peak there in the first phrase. We'll pick a peak here in the first phrase. And we'll pick a peak here in the third phrase. And then you would go in and you'd have to decide out of all of these peaks, which one is the biggest, right? Which one's the most important? And usually it's going to end up being somewhere near the third third of the piece of music. We could think of it as the third act, or perhaps the last quarter of the piece of music. Generally, it's going to be towards the end. These are rules of thumb, but I do think it's going to hold true in a lot of simple music, especially in carols. And we can verify that by just remembering this carol and thinking, does this peak here that we've decided, does that really make sense as our peak? And we just pick this out visually. One could argue it's either that F natural that we circled, or it's this E. It's got to be probably one of those two as the peak of that entire carol, in my opinion. But what you decide, again, when it comes to phrasing, is going to be subjective. But we're talking about phrasing for another reason. We're talking about it because in this carol, one of the things we want to benefit from it as violinists that are studying is we want to gain some technical benefit, right, from practicing. We don't want to just waste our time doing this. So we might choose, again, this is our peak. But within that phrase, why don't we go ahead and pick extra little peaks? Maybe the third beats of these measures actually. Silent night or silent night. Doesn't really feel like the first beat to me. It feels like the third. So we can find these miniature ones. And we pick maybe 4, 5, depending on the shape. In this case, we've picked 4 little peaks, and instead of thinking about half notes and beats, we're going to think about phrase peaks, and we're going to use those as areas where we want to focus on our vibrato. And if you find that your vibrato naturally occurs on other notes, don't necessarily stop it from happening, but just cue in on these little peaks. And if you're cueing into those little peaks, you might find that what naturally happens, certainly it's what naturally occurs for me, is that we have these kind of vibrato crescendos where a vibrato leading up to them gets a little bit more intense. That at least is what feels perhaps natural. Right from that E natural we can hear. Obviously, I'm supporting a little bit with the bow as well, doing a literal crescendo that's helping hammer the point home. All that being said, one of the main focuses we're going to be using this Silent Night for, and one of the main things we should think about when we're performing it, is just how pretty we can make our sound, specifically what we can do with the left hand, what we can do with vibrato, to really bring out the beauty of this really simple but beautiful carol. The next thing we can do to really help with that is talk about maybe more advanced fingerings. Now I have some written here, but one that's missing, that's not in the part, is something we can do, which is what I did in the very opening of this stream, is we can do a little shift here, 4-4, which really can give us quite a beautiful effect. I'm going to rush through the beginning, just so you can follow along the music. So here, what if we did... So what I did in that case is something that we refer to often in violin playing as a new bow shift. This means that we delay our shift, or rather we precede our shift with the change of bow. So I might even start it beforehand, but the bottom line is I'm not done shifting until I start the bow of that arrival note. And we get this really, that one might have been a little grotesque. We don't want it to be too crazy. How crazy it is depends on when you change the bow. And there's essentially unlimited options for how we time that. If we want the cleanest shift will often be where you change bow upon arrival. This is called an old bow shift. We're gonna shift, and then we'll change bow right when we arrive on that fourth finger. But anything in between is going to provide different levels of portamento. Regardless of when you change the bow, always think during your shift that you should be shifting a distance that is equivalent to bow usage during that shift. So if we're shifting from A to C natural, which is right around here, that's going to be about that much, and that's how much bow, at least, we should be using during the shift. You could use it all on the old bow, we could use it all here, or we could use it all on the new bow, or we could use it and spend that bow between the bows. We'll use half here, and then half on the down bow. I'll do that one more time so it's clear. Use half here, use half on the down bow. And then it doesn't have to be half, right? We can spend however much we want on the first part and however much we want on the second part. Coordinating it is a bitch. It's really, really hard. And if you have trouble shifting, I've actually made a course on it. It's one of the 2 courses on this channel so far, and totally free. It's just a YouTube playlist, but they call it courses now. You can take a look at that on my channel, and it's got 8 videos that take you through all my rules and steps of shifting. I highly recommend it if you haven't seen it. Although I will warn you, it's one of my older videos, so the audio quality is not necessarily as good as some of my newer things. Alright, let us move on. The rest of the fingering options that we can potentially do to spice this up, aside from just doing it in first position, is to just follow exactly what's written here, any of those shifts that you see here. I don't want to talk too much about that because I want to move on to the gift, the etude. In this case, the etude is all about left hand independence. And the way that we're going to learn and talk about this independence is by implementing this technique right here, the dreaded LH. This is going to be really useful for anybody who is comfortable in shifting already, would consider themselves perhaps a intermediate to advanced violinist. If you're a total beginner, don't get too intimidated, and you might learn something as well. The LH pizz refers to a left hand pizzicato, and the common actual marking for that is this little plus sign. So in this etude, we're essentially going to play literally the same thing as we did before. We're just adding in this new line, this simple left hand pizzicato. Simple is probably not the right word for this, but it's simple if you compare it to something like Sarasate or Paganini. So we have our line on top, which we can either do separate bows, or like we did in the actual carol slurred there. I'm going to do it separate for simplicity. And then at the first beat of every measure, we're going to add in a left hand pizzicato. And for the most part, we're going to do this left hand pizzicato with our pinky. So the first thing you should be able to do before you try and tackle this etude is you should be able to place your third finger, or rather all three of your fingers, on one string, in this case the D string, and then simultaneously pluck the G string. What you might find when you first do this, you might find that your fourth finger just doesn't want to move on its own. But if it does want to move on its own, one of the common issues we'll see with left-hand pizzicato is you'll hear this, which just means that your fingers that are on the other string are obstructing the G string. They're not clearing the G string. If one of them is barely touching the G string, you're going to end up with that kind of muted sound. So we're going to try and avoid that actively throughout this. Like I said, most of the left-hand pizzas in this are going to be with the fourth finger, but some of them are going to be with the third. So I would also practice placing the other three fingers and plucking with the third finger. You should also be comfortable, in order to play this etude, plucking with both the third and fourth finger on a stopped note. In this case, we'll use the first finger. If those things aren't comfortable, you're probably not ready for this etude, but that doesn't mean you're not ready to watch this stream and or ask any questions in the comments below. So let's take a look. We're going to play this etude once, maybe most of the way through, before we start talking about any issues or any difficulties that I feel coming on right off the bat. Well, let's try that again because that was super out of tune. So It's kind of tricky. There's a couple spots that I would have liked to have played better. In particular, I think the hardest spots are going to be when we have these left-hand pizzas during stopped notes, which is whenever we change chords and have this C on the bottom. That is really tricky, especially when we need to play it with the third finger here. So this is one of those examples of like, when you're doing an etude, you generally want to just do the fingering that is implied or marked, rather than doing a fingering that's easier. And that's again because etudes are for us to develop our skills way more than they are about the etude sounding really good. And one of the things we're doing here is we're developing strength and independence in both our third and our fourth finger. That's one of the reasons that left-hand pitch practice is so great, because our left-hand third and fourth finger are just born kind of useless, and then we have to bring them out of the muck our entire violin careers and just get them stronger. And left-hand pitch is a great way of practicing that. Now, so theoretically here at measure 237, instead of playing a fourth finger on the C, we could do a third finger, which would allow us to do a fourth finger pitch, which might be a little bit more comfortable. Generally, when we're doing a pizzicato of any kind, you want to pitch far away from wherever the note is being stopped. And so the fourth finger is usually going to be a lot easier to left-hand pitch because it's further away from the stopped notes. So using this third finger here, it can only be so far away because it's trapped by the fourth finger. But one of the things we can do to make it sound stronger without it actually physically being stronger is to prep it a little bit earlier. Oops, I plucked the wrong one. This is what I'm talking about, finger independence. Your brain kind of fries a little bit. Oh yeah, I forgot. That's one of the solutions we can do, is we can just pluck with our third finger from the get. So on the very first one. And that can prep our third finger a little bit earlier, and therefore we don't have to switch back and forth. But again, we can switch back and forth, use the fourth finger the first time, and it's going to be more confusing for our brains, but perhaps even better for our development. Ooh, yeah, that feels good. I mean, it feels horrible, but it feels like my brain is learning. Oh, terrible. That was good. So it's pretty confusing and complicated, but it's a really great exercise for developing, again, that left-hand independence, that finger independence in the left hand, specifically strengthening that third and fourth finger, which is something we always need on the instrument. If you're just tuning in, this can all be found in the 6 carols and 6 gifts, which the music obviously is on screen for you to easily pirate. It's legal, I'm telling you, you can pirate it. But if you did want to support the channel, you can buy it from the website, which the link is in the description below. Some final comments here on this left-hand pitch, and perhaps we can get to some questions if anybody has any. Is that the final step of doing this etude and the final complexity of it all is making your left-hand pitch, which the whole freak out and the whole worry, right, is my pizzicato speaking at all? But once you get it speaking consistently, you have to go a step further and get it to be related to your phrasing. Arguably, the phrasing should match what we decided on the previous bit, which was the actual carol itself. So let's match that phrasing. We've talked about these peaks. I'm going to just quickly mark them so we can see where we're aiming for each of these phrases. That's our first one that we talked about. That's our last one. Our second one was over here. And you know, that middle phrase is so much of an echo that maybe it's even more important than having a peak. We should think about where our trough is, where our low point is. And I think it's going to be right around here or here. We'll put those in a different color so that we can think about it when we get there. All right, let's try seeing if our left hand pits can be more related to our phrasing here. So we're not going to start so strong. You know, the more that I hear a harmony underneath, the more I almost feel like we picked the wrong peak here. I feel like we should pick the peak over here. It just feels like this is a more supplemental peak. Let's try right from there. Alright, with that, I think we can call this Monday Music Method in a little bit. Unless there's any questions, I don't see any in the chat at the moment. I do see a great from earlier. Thank you for watching. Alright, yeah, we'll leave it at that. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Make sure to tune in next week. We're going to do our 5th day of Christmas in next week's Monday Music Method, which will be Away in a Manger. We all know and love that carol. It's a very beautiful one, and a little sneak preview of what that etude looks like. It is quite taxing and challenging, but it's a ton of fun, and it will deal with left hand agility. So make sure you tune in, make sure you're subscribed, make sure you like this, make sure all those things. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next week. Happy practicing, everybody.